What can the Knicks expect out of Karl-Anthony Towns? What can the Wolves expect out of Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo? It's crossover time with Locked On Wolves to talk it all out.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, welcome into Locked On Knicks. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You could start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Knicks first listen today and every day, whether you're checking us out on your favorite podcast platform or taking in the sights and sounds on YouTube. We appreciate you making us part of your daily routine. Make sure you hit that auto download function on your favorite podcast app or the notification bell on YouTube, so you never miss an episode, including this one and including all the ones coming out, because we're back to 5 days a week for you guys now. I'm Alex Wolf. I'm editor-in-chief of Knicks site, The Strickland, which you can find at thestrick.land. And I'm joined today by Ben Beecken, the host of Locked On Wolves, because if you didn't hear, over the weekend, there's a little trade between the Knicks and the Timberwolves that sent Karl-Anthony Towns to the Knicks and Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo to the Timberwolves. So we're talking through Cat's fit in New York. A lot of defense talk, because that was the thing that we were both most curious about with our respective players here. And then some offense talk, some Donte talk to end the show. It's a jam-packed show, so let's get right into it. It's crossover time. You knew we had to do it. Locked On Knicks and Locked On Wolves. I'm Alex Wolf from Locked On Knicks. He's Ben Beecken from Locked On Wolves. And we are talking through what else? The Karl-Anthony Towns for Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo trade, which just made for a lovely weekend, Ben. I don't know how was your Friday night?
It was a surprise Friday night. Yeah, I got home Friday night and was like, I had a couple texts like, "No way, what just happened?" And I, of course, I assumed it was Wolves related, but I didn't know what. And then there it was.
Yeah, thank goodness it was a benign thing, right?
I know.
Do you see this disaster?
Well, you assume like the weekend before media day and everything is like relatively safe, that nothing crazy is going to happen. But this was like it felt like the James Harden to OKC, or from OKC to Houston trade like a decade ago, is that sort of timing almost.
Yeah. So once you got your bearings and saw the details of the trade, what was your reaction? Because I know I was like, I saw it, and I was getting ready to record another episode anyway. And then I was like, well, guess just scrap that. Because now I got to talk about this. And then initially I was like, I don't know if I want to say confused, but like definitely a little emotional. It was weird. Like Randle had been with this team a long time. So I knew that maybe the day would come when he would get traded. But when I saw that he was in it, I was like, oh, that kind of stings. And then seeing Donte in there too, I was like, that kind of stings too. He was going to be part of like the whole Nova group this year. That was going to be so fun. But then seeing Cat come back too, it's a guy that I went back before we recorded this. I listened to our episode that we did last year, where there was like a rough rumor of potentially, the Knicks being interested in Cat. And, I was sort of like, I don't know if I love the fit, because, I just, the defense and the this and the that, and I was making all these reasons to not like it. So seeing his name pop up as like Cat's a Knick now, I was like, oh man, this is a guy I've not exactly been kind to in recent years, that now is going to be playing for my favorite team, trying to potentially win a championship. So I think there was a decent amount of shock and awe on my end, but I don't know what it was like on your end.
Yeah, I mean, actually, a lot of the same stuff, right? Like, I mean, Karl-Anthony Towns rumors have been out there since like, I don't know, year 2 of his career, year 3 of his career. Basically, as soon as he won Rookie of the Year, it was, it felt like everybody wanted Karl-Anthony Towns to not be in Minnesota. And then we went through this period where he's, Cat said all the right stuff, right? He signed a couple extensions in Minnesota. He even said, like, it was at the end of the year, exit interviews this year, he was like, look, I want to retire here. Like, I want to win a championship here. Like, I love it here. This is where I've grown up, like all this stuff. And, that's all circulating again now, because everybody's like, can't believe he's gone, like 9 years in Minnesota. Like, that very rarely happens. And he was there, he was the second best player in the Jimmy Butler team that went to the playoffs. He was the best player really in Ant's first year that they went to the playoffs. I would say Cat was the best player on that team. And then he completely reshaped himself and, from a basketball standpoint, to be the second option last year and to also take on a different role defensively. We can get more into that, but like Chris Finch talked a lot, the Timberwolves head coach, about how much Cat has sacrificed, somebody who had been a 2-time All-NBA player, a multiple-time All-Star, like to sacrifice the way he did last year and completely change how he played for the betterment of the team and for it to work. And then he turns around and gets traded basically on the eve of training camp is a really tough thing. And it's a tough sell to Wolves fans who, well, yes, I think anybody that's a fan of Cat or has watched Cat has a love-hate relationship with how he plays, and I'm sure we'll get into that too. The dude cares. He's a good dude. He's really good at basketball, and he's been in Minnesota for almost a decade. And so to see him traded at this point in the offseason, especially so unexpectedly, I think was the toughest thing. And then you got on peel all the layers of the onion in terms of what it means on the court. And, like there's a lot to get into there. I'm not convinced it makes the Wolves better. I've seen a lot of different takes out there. Like, does this help? Who does this help more? Like is it? It's so hard to know because there's a lot of. I mean, you already kind of briefly laid out the case. Like Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo meant a lot to the Knicks. Cat meant a lot to the Wolves for a long time. It's just I think it caught everybody by surprise, and that's made everybody kind of be on their heels a little bit in terms of evaluating it.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know if I've ever seen a more divisive trade as far as like the immediate trade grades and everything. I feel like usually the grades kind of come in and from the various pundits, and it's like A+ for the team that improved, that's trying to win a championship, and then A+ also for the other team because they got value back and they're going into a rebuild or whatever. But this is kind of the rare trade where both these teams have, I think, realistic, or at least somewhat realistic, finals aspirations this year. Like these two teams think that they could potentially win their respective conferences. Both came pretty darn close last year. I mean, the Knicks, barring all the injuries, looked like they could have probably made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. The Wolves did make it to the Western Conference Finals. And, I think there was a real case to be made that both teams, did it with, getting a year older, a year better, whatever, could have potentially, and the Knicks obviously making the Bridges trade and all that. Like they did stuff this offseason, I think, to try to get better. And the Timberwolves through the draft and everything else. Like there was a lot of moving parts that said both these teams just are trying to get better. And so it was bizarre to see this happen at this particular juncture. But if I could start getting into specific fit and whatever, I'm curious what your thought is on. So Cat and the T-Wolves found their most success the last couple years in the somewhat risky experiment of putting Cat with Rudy Gobert, which I remember when I first heard about it, I was like, like that's going to work. Like, I was like, I don't think that's going to work at all. Like, why did they give up so much for Gobert to move Cat to the 4? Like, I thought he had a hard time keeping up with guys at the 5. Like, what makes them think this is going to work at the 4? And then it worked really good. And they were like one of the top defenses in the NBA. So I'm kind of curious. The number one thing that's coming to my mind when I'm thinking with my pessimistic side of my brain with this deal is, what do you think is going to happen if the Knicks are going to start Cat at the 5, which I think they're going to have to do for at least the first month or two of the season while they wait for Mitchell Robinson to come back. And then they can decide if they want to kind of make their own, like, Cat and Rudy Light sort of combo there with Mitchell Robinson instead of Rudy Gobert. But as of right now, I think he's going to have to start at center. Like, what's sort of your opinion on that? Considering I think that arrangement sort of came with mixed results with the Timberwolves when they trotted him out there as like the center.
Yeah, I think it really depends on who the opponent is, but if you go back and look at how the Wolves defended when Tibbs was running the team, their defense was actually, like, their offense was generally better than their defense under Tibbs. And a big part of that was the way they did deploy Cat. I mean, they treated him like a rim protecting 5, and they played, they ended up playing quite a bit of drop coverage. I think early on they played more of Tibbs' old, ice coverage, and they kind of, tried a couple different things with him, but he was always the 5, right? Like, he never played the 4. Tibbs was never, they acquired Taj Gibson, as of course the Knicks did as well, as of course every Tibbs team does. And Taj Gibson was playing the 4 next to Cat. They did try playing him with Gorgui Dieng, way back in the day. Gorgui Dieng played the 4 though, and Cat played the 5. And it never really worked defensively with Cat at the 5 previously. So that is a big question mark. I mean, what he did this last year for Minnesota is he played the 4, Rudy Gobert was protecting the rim, protecting the paint. They would allow Cat to be in a lot of the actions on the perimeter where possible. Um, two, 2 or 3 years actually pre Rudy Gobert. So actually, this is probably what I would say is the most successful Cat's been pre Rudy Gobert. Was the first year under Chris Finch, and they played a really aggressive kind of blitzing scheme and pick and roll game almost all the time. Like they always had Cat at the level, and then would even show higher than that and really kind of trap the ball handler on the perimeter a lot. Like it wasn't just like a we'll do this at the end of clock situations. Like it was all the time. That was the Wolves team that got the 6th seed and lost to Memphis in the first round before the Rudy Gobert trade. They had Jared Vanderbilt on the team. They had Patrick Beverly. They were kind of playing this frenetic, like just crazy, let's generate turnovers defense. And it actually worked pretty well because Cat's really mobile for a big, for somebody who plays the 5. And he mostly played the 5 that season. It worked really well. Last year, it was more dependent on matchups. Like in the playoffs, Karl-Anthony Towns was the primary defender against Kevin Durant last year and didn't shut him down, but there were a couple games he did, and Durant was not successful. The Wolves swept the Suns, and then he was the primary defender on Nikola Jokic in the second round, took 7 games, and the Wolves had the crazy comeback in game 7 to win. But that's because Cat is such a physical defender, and sometimes to a fault, it will get him into foul trouble. That's a big issue for him. It still is. But he can be a physical defender. He can also move his feet and stay in front of people. And so he's not going to protect the rim. He's never had a high block rate. But if it's a 5 that wants to get in the post and back him down, not that there's too many of those, he's going to be fine. If it's a 5 that wants to shoot the 3, Cat's pretty mobile. You don't want him backpedaling and drop coverage. You don't want him, switched onto too many quick guards. Like he's not going to, not that you want to do that with any bigs. So there's still some question as to like, because if Tibbs used him like he did, 6 years ago, I don't think that he's going to have a lot of success. But if he can be treated more as this versatile piece where we say, hey, here's your role. You're going to lock in and defend Joker. You're going to lock in and defend this guy. He can have success. And I think he always got a bad rap in terms of how bad he was defensively. It's just, he was never going to be a traditional rim protector. That was never going to be what he was defensively. So I think maybe we lost the plot a little bit on that early in his career. He was always kind of a okay to below average defender. He was never horrific. And then last year he was genuinely good. And that's one of my concerns for the Wolves is losing Cat as a versatile defensive piece, because now you have Rudy protecting the rim. Julius Randle's not as good defensively overall as Cat. I don't know what that looks like. I at least the metrics aren't kind to Julius Randle. Did you ever feel like with Randle on the Knicks side that how is Tibbs using him as somebody who obviously is a defensive minded coach and the Knicks had a good defense? How is Julius Randle typically used defensively for the Knicks?
That's a great question. And I want to get into Julius Randle and how he might fit in Minnesota along with Donte DiVincenzo and all the great additions that we shipped over there. So we'll do that in just a second, plus get into some more Cat, especially on the offensive end, because I want to hear you gush about that. So we'll do that in just a moment when we get back in.
Today's crossover episode of Locked On Wolves and Locked On Knicks is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Looking at the win totals, I was surprised to not see any movement on FanDuel. At least the Wolves are still 52.5. Do you know what the Knicks were before, Alex? They're at 54.5. I think that's what they were before the trade too.
I think they raised up just a little bit. I think they were in the low 50s. So I think they've been granted a couple extra games by our friends at FanDuel.
Okay. That sounds right. Yeah, because I feel like they were about the same as the Wolves. The Wolves are still 52.5. So no movement based on this trade, which probably feels about right. Obviously big NFL Sunday this Sunday, lots of games going on, and then 2 Monday night games this week as well. So if you're on FanDuel tonight, go check that out as we lead into double Monday Night Football. Again, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out latest stats, view live play-by-play, and more on the same page. You place your bets. You can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel at FanDuel.com.
So before the break, Ben, you asked me about Julius Randle's defense and how Tibbs deployed him. And I think the answer there is he was never necessarily featured. I don't know that they necessarily tried to hide him either. I think my overall take on Julius Randle, better as a individual defender than a team defender, for sure. And that showed a lot. I mean, there were some times, especially early on before they added an OG Anunoby, and certainly if he had gotten to play this year, they would have had Mikal Bridges as well. So that's really nice. That's going to make life really easy on everybody on the perimeter, that the Knicks have these two guys to handle those assignments. So that'll make like Jalen Brunson's life really easy, Josh Hart's life easy, all that, Cat's life easy. But before that, I mean, Randle did pick up some pretty high profile one-on-one matchups. I mean, in matchups with Giannis, he would take that assignment. In matchups with Luka, he would take that assignment sometimes. In matchups with trying to think, I think like KD from time to time, although from what I remember, KD kind of torched him a couple times. But like he played surprisingly well against the likes of the guys that stand out in my mind, of like the ones where I was like, wow, that was pretty good, were Luka and Giannis. Like he played those two pretty well in one-on-one defense from time to time. And so if you have a bigger wing type dude staring you down from the other side, Randle can potentially handle that for you. And at his best, do it pretty well. At his worst, if he's disengaged on defense, forget about it. Like he has to be fully locked in. And that was one of the issues, not in recent memory, thankfully, but one of the issues like in the darkest times with Julius Randle would be, you would just go, what is this dude doing? Like he's pure space cadet out there. Like it would just seem like he wasn't even trying on defense, which is the worst possible thing you can see. And that was one of those things where, like in the worst season of it all was the 21-22 season. And in that year, I could just remember, I mean, it led to me wanting both Tibbs and Randle gone that year, because Randle was playing like that and not paying attention on defense and whatever. And Tibbs was letting him get off the hook for it, which was where I was like, aren't you like Mr. Hard-Nosed, Mr. Defense First, Mr. Whatever? Like, why are you letting this guy get away with it? But you'll pull Emmanuel quickly or whatever for, missing one rotation or whatever. So, it was a little frustrating at times, but I would say the last 2 years, and this bodes well for the Wolves, with having Brunson be more of the leader on offense and Randle being sort of the secondary option there, I feel like it helped Randle a bit on defense, where he seemed to lock in a little more on that end, because he knew that he didn't have to do it all on the offensive end. And I think that was kind of, rightly or wrongly, that was probably part of his head calculus was, well, I'm doing everything on offense. So, if I got to take a play off or two on defense, like, so be it, because I'm doing everything on offense. And that excuse kind of evaporated. And he also just really enjoyed, I think, playing on a team that really had something to play for the last couple years. So my overall answer, not the best in the passing lanes. He'll do his job, and I think most of the time he'll be around an average level defender, but occasionally he'll stand out in those one-on-one matchups that kind of make you go wow and say, like, I think this guy might have things figured out as far as some of the more difficult one-on-one matchups in the league.
That's interesting. And I mean, the Wolves may give him like he's going to have opportunities to guard some of those same guys Cat guarded. And obviously Rudy Gobert's defense lifts everybody's defense, as evidenced by every team he's been on except one being a top 10 defense in his whole career. The 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards, say what we want to say about Rudy, but he elevates everybody else around him defensively because there's less pressure. And that certainly helped Cat, which I think, like this is a little ways down the road, it sounds like, but Cat with Mitchell Robinson should work very similarly. And I think he'll be much better. If you want Cat to protect the paint, that's not necessarily going to be the case. So I am curious to see what kind of defenses Tibbs puts out there if Cat's going to be playing the 5 early on.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if it works with Mitch as well. And, I wonder if that's what Tibbs will ultimately want to go with. Now, of course, the Knicks sort of have some smoke now, or at least there's some smoke circulating that Mitch might also be on the trade block. And Mitch is certainly acting bizarre the last couple days on social media, to the point where it makes you wonder if he kind of knows that he's on the block at this point, or is about to be traded or something. So I don't know if that's about to come to pass, but I would love to see how that pairing works, because like I said, I was skeptical about that Gobert and Cat pairing, and they really made that work. And hearing what you're saying about Cat, it goes against what I thought my perception of him was as a defender. In that you're saying that he's actually quite fleet of foot and good at playing like passing lanes and like crowding someone on defense. It's more just the drop coverage aspect, which Tibbs does love that. So
so I don't know that I describe him as fleet of foot, but I would say that he's struggles the most with drop coverage. Like,
Mhm.
it's not hard to find. If you look at anything he did, the Ryan Saunders years when their defense was being coordinated by David Vanterpool, they exclusively played drop, and just could not figure out how far should I be dropping, how close should I be to the ball handler. They would get torched by, the Kyries and the D'Los of the world who would just pull up and shoot elbow jumpers all game. And Cat never quite figured it out. And then as soon as he got a very, if he, like what you said about Randle, if he's given a very specific assignment, like go guard Jokic, he's going to be physical with him. And somehow, like, the numbers of Cat guarding Jokic are better than almost anybody else that's guarded him one-on-one as much as he has. And then he can also, he's quick enough laterally for a big that he can stay in front of guys like a Kevin Durant, well enough. Right. And so he's not a great help defender. The block rate's never been outstanding. He doesn't get a ton of steals. He does have lapses off the ball a little bit, but if he has a very specific assignment and can, be like, tell him like, hey, this is what your job is. And he doesn't have to get too lost in the wash defensively. Like, he was really good at the blitzing coverage. He was solid at, guarding some of these guys one-on-one. He's fine in pick and roll because he's quick enough laterally. He's definitely not as bad defensively as the internet would have led you to believe like 2 years ago, right? Like, he's actually gotten better. He's gotten smarter as a player. And I think if in the right situation, he won't be a negative defensively.
Well, that's great. I mean, those are things that I love to hear, certainly, because he's definitely going to need to step up and be the starting center, I think, to start this season. And so they're going to have to figure out what works with him best pretty much right away. I will say Tibbs does love his drop coverage, but he has had guys like Mitchell Robinson and Isaiah Hartenstein showing more out to the shooter than previously in his career, and certainly more than he did at the beginning of his tenure with the Knicks. It was basically like that center had better be like dropping all the way back on that coverage, because he was just daring anybody to come in and challenge Mitchell Robinson, or at the time of that first season, Nerlens Noel. And over time that evolved into Mitch and Hartenstein. But over the years, as he started learning, like, if we're facing a really good shooter, probably shouldn't leave like Steph Curry or Dame Lillard all alone out there off of a pick. And, as much as Jalen Brunson or Deuce McBride or whoever wants to fight over it, they might not be able to get over it enough. So he has started adjusting and having his bigs shade out a little more.
And one last thing on that, with the Wolves, I mean, Rudy Gobert is one of the best in the league at drop coverage, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so the Wolves actually did use it, just not when Cat was on the floor at the 4. They would make sure Rudy was, as much as possible. If like Cat was on the floor with Naz Reid and essentially playing the 5, which is what would happen if it was Cat and Naz with Rudy on the bench, then the Wolves would play at the level. Like, they wouldn't play drop. If Rudy was on the floor, they would play drop. Usually it was if Rudy was in the action, they would play drop, and not if Cat was in the action. So they really kind of picked their spots with that. And it was much more creative than any other Wolves defense in recent memory. And the Wolves were the best defense in the league by far last year. So Cat was clearly a part of that. And I swear, like I said this I did a bonus episode Saturday after the trade, and I would be willing to bet that the way that Cat defended in the playoffs was something that maybe tipped the scales for the Knicks to take a fresh look at this. And the Wolves say, hey, are we almost kind of selling a little bit high now before we get deeper into this contract? Because Cat I know he didn't play great in the conference finals. I get that. But he was legit the most valuable player in the first 2 rounds with the way he defended, and showing that versatility and locking in. And I mean, that really can't be overlooked. And I'm not saying he's like you're not always going to put him on the other team's best player, but the Wolves had the luxury of knowing they had Rudy Gobert roaming the back line. So if Mitchell Robinson's not on the floor, and I also don't know that I wouldn't call him Rudy either, but if he's not on the floor, you're not necessarily going to say, okay, Cat, go guard, Kevin Durant for 48 minutes, because you need a bit of a safety blanket. And so that was, or security blanket. And that was certainly part of it, but Cat certainly rose to the challenge more often than not in recent years defensively.
And that's things you love to hear as a Knicks fan. And famously, I mean, he's going to be going from potentially needing to match up with Jokic more often, and now potentially having to match up with Joel Embiid, who he famously beat up one time, which is awesome. I love that as a Knicks fan. It's about time someone beat that guy up. So maybe he could bring some of that and some of that same energy into those Embiid matchups. But we got to talk a little more about the offense of the two main guys in this trade. Talk a lot about defense, the thing that they're probably worst at so far. So let's talk about the thing that they're best at in just a second. Talk about Karl-Anthony Towns' offense, Julius Randle's offense, and some Donte DiVincenzo talk. I certainly don't want him to be slept on. Fantastic player that the Wolves managed to get as well. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first, I got to let you all know about our friends over at Gametime. And Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets to your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And I've used this feature recently. I wanted to go to some pennant race Mets games. Luckily, they didn't blow it today in one of their last chances to potentially make the postseason. But I got to see some of that magical run earlier this month, thanks to Gametime, because I was like, well, I want to go to a bunch of games, but I don't want to pay a ton of money. I used that Gametime Picks feature, and they showed me some amazing tickets that were listed for probably way lower than they should have been, but I'm not one to complain. And I bought them, and I got to go to the Mets game and have a great time. Saw 2 wins, saw lots of home runs. I saw that 9-run half inning. It was so much fun. So if you like going to live events, I would suggest checking out Gametime too, because man, it's a great time, and it's great not having to pay a ton of money, especially now with the Knicks season coming up. Even face value is a ton of money, so maybe someone will list for a little less than that on a weeknight or something. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, Ben, we're back to keep talking through here. Cat and Randle, and we've talked a lot about defense. But like I said, I think we should talk a little bit about offense, right? Isn't that what these guys both do best? So I'm curious what you think about the Brunson and Cat pairing. I did a podcast with some of my buddies earlier today, Pod Strickland of the Strickland, my website that I run, and we were talking about this, and I was thinking to myself, I was kind of just like thinking out loud, like, man, that pick and roll, pick and pop, just overall pick action between Brunson and Cat. I feel like the Knicks should start damn near every possession with that this year, because that is just going to be such a difficult thing to guard for opposing teams. Because to me, when I watch Cat, I'm like, this guy is not just like Brook Lopez or whatever, where he's going to go out there, set that screen, and immediately fade to the 3-point line. Like, yes, he is a 40% volume 3-point shooter, but he's got like moves on the inside as well. Is a great finisher, has a little hook. He's got like a floater. He's got every possible offensive move that you could want, in addition to just being a big body dude that can back someone down, overpower them, and get a basket inside. I feel like the Knicks need to just spam that pick and roll every single time they come down. And then if the defense decides to overreact, kick it out to Mikal Bridges, who just proved over his tenure with the Nets that like he could put the ball on the floor. He can create some offense for himself. Like, I think they're in really good shape here as far as what that 2-man combo is going to look like. But what's sort of your opinion on that? Because I don't think it's a stretch to say that just from a point guard perspective, Jalen Brunson is going to be, I think, all apologies to Ricky Rubio, definitely the best one that Cat has played with in his career. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're not wrong. And I would say, like, I would compare, obviously Jalen Brunson is a point guard, but I would compare this to like what the Ant and Cat pick and roll started to become. I mean, Gerson Rosas's big move, like there's people are talking about how like when Rosas wants somebody, like, he wants him, he's going to get him. He got Cat. The move that's equivalent to that in Minnesota was getting D'Angelo Russell. And obviously that didn't turn out great. But that was kind of the idea. It was like, oh, this D'Lo Cat pairing, it's going to be so dynamic. D'Lo's nowhere near the player, obviously, Jalen Brunson is. D'Lo did not ever show any interest in putting pressure on the rim consistently, and obviously Brunson can do that. Brunson is so much more talented, so much more physical than D'Lo, and actually also a better 3-point shooter. So we saw, the beginnings of that working with D'Lo, and then we saw it kind of continue to progress with Ant this last year, the pick and roll game with Cat. Cat this last year, though, he popped over 90% of the time in when he would set a screen. Part of that is they would run horn sets, and Rudy would be the one that rolls and Cat would be the one that pops, and they would have a ton of different actions kind of around that. And also because Cat is just full stop one of the best shooters in the entire league, big man or otherwise. He's phenomenal. So, and catch and shoot wise, he's also unbelievable. And he can shoot off the dribble. Like no matter what the number is, like if he has the ball in his hands or if he's catch and shoot, he's a great 3-point shooter. I'm curious to see what Tibbs does with this too. Like when Tibbs was in Minnesota, that was when Cat first started shooting more threes. Like Cat's rookie year was right after Flip Saunders passed away, and Sam Mitchell was the interim head coach. And like Sam Mitchell's a year center, you're not shooting threes guy. And he didn't shoot a lot of threes. And then Tibbs was the one that actually was like, yeah, go ahead, shoot some threes. But he also had him with his back to the basket a lot. And that it didn't completely go away, but he did a lot less of it the last couple of years under Chris Finch. He's really good in the post. And he can literally do everything offensively. His biggest issue is offensive fouls. And I know that sounds like it's not a big deal, but it's a really big deal for Cat. He actually had the league's worst or highest offensive foul rate over the last couple of years. Like he committed, however many fouls a game, and like literally half of them were offensive fouls. Like it's crazy. But he does everything else well. Like there was a period of time where he did most of his damage offensively last year, 2 years ago, really, facing up. Like they would get him the ball on the perimeter and he would pump fake. He'd take his guy off the dribble, and he's not like Cat's not super athletic. He doesn't jump super high, but he's got really long strides. And I know that sounds crazy, but like there was some stat when he was drafted about how long his strides are. So he could get to the rim in like two steps basically. And so he does this like exaggerated like step through where he can go up and under and draw a foul and finish with the contact. And as long as he's not flailing his arms and committing offensive fouls, like his face-up game is a lot more dangerous than people realize. And you have to respect the 3-point shot. So he gets crowded and then he puts the ball on the floor and can be really dangerous there. So I do think mixing in some more post-ups for him, getting him to roll more. You don't want to lose the 3-point threat though. Like you don't, or the 3-point, really the volume. And that was one of my issues with the last couple of years is his volume actually went down a little bit outside the arc for Minnesota over the last year and a half. And he's a 40% career 3-point shooter. Like that volume can't go down. So, I think he's going to get a lot of opportunity in pick and roll with Jalen Brunson. And we saw that chemistry start to develop a little bit with Ant, but he truly is a 3-level scorer. Like he can score from anywhere on the floor. And as long as he's not committing an offensive foul, it's really hard to stop Karl-Anthony Towns. Like he's a genuinely, really, really impactful offensive talent.
Things you love to hear. I feel like you're just telling me all kinds of great stuff here. I'm feeling better and better about this trade with every passing minute. I'm curious if there are any things that I can ease your mind on a little bit as far as Julius Randle on the offensive end.
Yeah. So my concern with Randle is, and I always feel like I need to like qualify this with, I know Julius Randle's, he's been an all NBA player. He just was an all-star the last couple of years, 3-time all-star. I think like he's a good player. I know he's a good player. My concern is, what's his role look like on offense if Ant is the one that everything's revolving around and Rudy is Rudy, so he's in the dunker spot and you're not running plays for Rudy. He might set a screen, but then he's going to fade to the dunker spot. He's not doing anything else. Where does Randle operate in between? And I know he's a adept kind of mid-range, like he gets his shot off in the mid-range. He's a pretty good mid-range shooter. The 3-point shot hasn't been there the last couple of years. My main concerns are spacing related. And also how's Julius Randle going to handle it if Ant is using all these possessions and Randle's maybe the usage rate goes down a little bit. I know he played with Jalen Brunson, but like, is he going to be okay with Ant dominating so much of the offense? And then when he picks his spots, are they going to fit within the framework of the offense, or is it going to feel very like my turn, your turn? And is Julius Randle only going to be operating in the mid-range inefficiently? And I just have concerns about spacing and overall efficiency with Randle as kind of really should be the second option this year for the Wolves.
So let me ask you a very brief question first. How do you feel about Anthony Edwards's off-ball and spot-up game as far as being able to like navigate the perimeter, catch and shoot, that sort of thing?
Overall positive progress. He's made progress. He had to last year, right? Because Cat was out so much the year before. So, yeah, I mean, he's a good spot-up shooter.
Okay, so if you feel good about that, I think you can reasonably feel pretty good about Randle. So the main thing with how the Brunson and Randle dynamic worked, I do think at times it was a little bit your turn, my turn. But the thing that kind of made that work is the fact that, especially on the Brunson end, Brunson played off Luka Doncic for so long that he knows how to navigate that situation. He knows how to find his spots and get 3-point opportunities. And then if you look by the numbers, like Brunson actually shoots, I mean, for as good of a pull-up shooter as he is, and like an off the dribble guy, he actually does his most damage off of spot ups, like his most efficient damage, I should say, off spot ups. And that was something that, had Randle still been on the team, I really want to see a lot of this year. I think ultimately what we're going to end up seeing now is actually that he takes less of those, because I think he's going to be more involved with initiating the action of the offense now with Cat. Because Cat, you're not necessarily going to hand the ball like Randle and be like, go figure it out, which was Randle's role for a lot of time. I will say Randle made some adjustments the first year that Brunson was in New York, and then carried it into last year. Had his stats last year a little bit misleading. He had, like, if you look at the full season stats, he had an abysmal start to the year. Just a disgusting first month and a half. And it was really, really bad, almost inexplicably bad. And then he really came on strong from like December-ish through like when he got hurt in that Heat game. And especially during that stretch when OG Anunoby had showed up to the team. He was playing so much better. He was shooting better from three, which was a huge deal because he started the year shooting like 20% from three for like a month. Like it was really bad. It was a really bad start to the year. So once he figured that out, he figured this out his first year with Brunson too. He sort of realized, so during the 2020 to 21 season, when he first sort of came around as a 3-point shooter, he was a low volume, high percentage 3-point shooter. So he shot 40%, but on like 2.5 attempts per game or something like that. Like he was not utilizing that a ton. He was taking a ton of middies and basically playing like, it was almost like a facsimile of how Carmelo Anthony used to play with the Knicks, like operating out of the mid post and taking lots of turnarounds, lots of mid-range shots, stuff like that. And it worked. I mean, it worked great for him that year. He had a super efficient mid-range season, which we later learned was, I think, in large part due to the empty stadiums, the hitter's backdrop, so to speak. He definitely benefited from that. And that led to his mid-range numbers, I think, getting inflated that year. So then that next year was kind of a disaster. And the first year with Brunson, the 2 years after that, 2020 to 21 breakout season, he sort of figured out like, I need to shoot more 3-pointers and less mid-range shots. So his shot diet has actually been much more like modern NBA, like either take it at the rim or take it from three and the last couple of years. So I think from that perspective, you don't have too much to worry about there. He can still make a mid-range shot if he has to, but it's not his bread and butter anymore, like it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, however long ago that was.
Okay. That's good to hear. I mean, like, because that would be my, like, the spacing. I've seen Wolves fans say in the last couple of days on Twitter, like, the spacing wasn't good last year. Why are we so worried about the spacing being bad? And my answer was, well, just because it wasn't good doesn't mean that adding somebody who's a worse 3-point shooter is going to make it better. And so I had concerns about like Randle. Just if teams aren't going to respect the 3-point shot, are they going to take that threat seriously? But I would think that they would have to take, a catch and say that Ant drives and kicks the ball to Randle, even if they're not necessarily closing out to the touch on a 3-point shot, they're at least going to have to respect the drive to the basket from Julius Randle, because that's how he's going to score a ton of his points, right?
Yeah, and he got much better with that, I think, the last 2 years as well. All he needs is just enough respect from three, and then he is just a bulldozer getting to the rim. And he's great at, he's a really good ball handler for his size. He occasionally, if he's not perfectly locked in, he'll struggle a little bit with ball control close to the rim and will get stripped sometimes. He had all kinds of nicknames his first year with the Knicks, Beyblade, the Big Apple turnover, like all this other stuff, because he would spin a little too much and utilize that move a little too much and get caught with his pants down, and people would he was keeping the ball way too far out from his body and people were slapping it out. Now he's just kind of a clutch the ball tight, get in there hard and, throw a shoulder into somebody and throw up a strong attempt and actually attempt to make it every time. Whereas he, I think, fell into the trappings of flailing a little too much in his first season or two. So yeah, I think he's gotten a lot better from that regard. I will just say, from the perspective of like volume 3-point shooting, teams go on and off with whether they respect him or not. And usually he has to start burning them in a game before they'll start actually going out there. So he has to make one or two early, because he was like, you're now going from a guy who, Cat was a 8 attempts per game, 40+% 3-point shooter, to a guy now in Randle that 2 years ago, again, I'll throw out last year just because of the fact that it was injury shortened and everything. But 2 years ago, took 8 threes per game and made 34% of them, which
Yeah.
is not as good. It's passable, and it gets the shots up there. And if you have good offensive rebounding with Rudy Gobert, you can make up for some of that, which the Knicks did that year. Their staple was getting offensive rebounds off of brick threes. They were not a great 3-point shooting team that year. But all in all, he's going to get those attempts up, and generally will get the respect as long as he can make one or two early.
It's apparently like there's all this reporting out there about how the Knicks have been interested in Cat for a long time, and this has at least been entertained for a while. And the Knicks had been unwilling to include Donte DiVincenzo in the trade previously. And at some point this summer, they said, all right, let's talk about it. I mean, I guess he's only been there a year or 2 years, right? No, 1 year.
1 year.
Only 1 year, yeah. So earlier in the year, that was something like probably deadline, I'm guessing. And the Wolves were interested in DiVincenzo in free agency. Yeah, it was after the Golden State season. So yeah, so 2 years ago, last summer, the Wolves wanted DiVincenzo. He goes to the Knicks. The Knicks had said all along, we're not going to trade him. He's under a very team-friendly contract, I think like 3 years, another 30-ish, 32 million, something like that. And he gets included in the deal. And the Wolves, like, I think the contract is one of the most attractive things for a team that's over the second apron. Like, the finances were the motivating factor behind this for Minnesota overall. So getting somebody who's controlled for the next 3 years at a really reasonable salary for what he can provide is huge. For fans that only really saw DiVincenzo play as like a role player, like with those Bucks teams and with Golden State, last year was a breakout year for him scoring volume wise in the starting lineup, primarily for the Knicks. I mean, what do Wolves fans need to know about what DiVincenzo can bring to the table? I guess both sides of the floor, but I think whatever 16 plus points per game or whatever he had last year, I think is what really stood out to me. I didn't realize he scored that much with the Knicks last season, but tell us a little bit about what Wolves fans have to look forward to with DiVincenzo.
Well, and what's crazy about that is that's another guy who his early season numbers dragged down his overall production of last year too, because he spent about the first 20 games kind of fighting for his life, trying to steal Quentin Grimes' job, and then successfully doing so. And then Grimes just kind of got into the doghouse and eventually got traded in the Bojan Bogdanovic deal. But man, his 3-point shooting is insane. I mean, you want to talk about, there was questions about Randle's 3-point shooting. None of those with Donte DiVincenzo. I mean, even for the fact that he spent the first 20 or so games of the year playing like 10 to 15 minutes a game, he wound up last year. I've referenced the stat a million times. Now you can. I'm passing the stat on to you. He was number 3 in threes taken and number 3 in threes made last year, behind only Steph Curry and Luka Doncic. I mean, that should tell you a lot of what you need to know about this guy. Like the fact that in basically, we'll call it, I guess, 7/8 of the season, because, if you want to turn that, say that the first 20 games or so only counts for about half of what it was in the overall like minute scape of everything. He did that in basically 7/8 of the season, which is insane. The way that he turned it on down the stretch of the season when the Knicks needed him most. I mean, there were some times where he and Josh Hart had to go out there and basically play 48 straight minutes. I mean, Hart literally did it. Donte almost did it a few times. And just went out there, and Donte in those games where Brunson had to miss it after everybody thought that Brunson like destroyed his leg or whatever. And, but then he didn't. But he still had to miss like 2 weeks. Donte went out there and was like a 1A scorer, which was insane because the guy he was barely a thought of a role player at the beginning of the year. Like he was like a depth piece to start the year, and then became a guy who stepped in and had to become like a 1A scorer at times for this team last year. And then we even saw in the playoffs it scaled. He struggled a bit in the Sixers series, but really came through in the Pacers series, I think. So, it took him a little bit to get his bearings in the playoffs, maybe exercise some demons, because like he had a rep as being like a playoff dropper, a guy that would get into the playoffs and then all of a sudden couldn't remember how to shoot the ball as well as previously. But he really, he did so great for himself. I think he had a fantastic year last year. I'm sad to see Randle go, and a lot of that is the emotional attachment, of him being the guy that sort of put the Knicks on his back and helped bring them back and all that good stuff. But there's a much easier way in your head to justify in this trade. Like, okay, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're basically trading Randle for Cat, you could see where that's a big upgrade in many ways. And so fine, you can live with that a little more. but just straight up losing Donte DiVincenzo in this deal and not really having anyone to hang your hat on of like, oh yeah, that guy replaces Dante's production. I think the Knicks they're gonna miss that a lot. And I think the T-Wolves really got themselves like, if you felt at any point last year like, man, it would really be nice if we had one more 3-point shooter on the floor right now. Guess what? You just found him. I mean, he's the guy. And if he, being removed from his best Villanova buds is still able to do the same stuff that he did last year, and the power of friendship stays strong with him even halfway across the country, this is going to be a really fun year for him, I think, on the Wolves, because I could see it very easily being a situation where he's going to be like a high minute six man for them that will probably close a decent amount of games with that shooting.
Yeah, and that to me is like we could clearly, this trade was motivated on the Wolves side for financial reasons, but obviously they still see themselves as finals contenders, and so they couldn't give Cat up for quote unquote nothing, right? Like there had to be. So I'm sure that's why the DiVincenzo piece was like, look, we have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say like, hey, we got deeper or something, right? Beyond just the financial flexibility. And now I think that's a legitimate, like for Wolves fans who do really like this trade, that's one of the things is like, hey, we added another rotation player. And before it was, we have 7 of 8 rotation guys from last year, but we're replacing Kyle Anderson with 37-year-old Joe Ingles and 19-year-old 160-pound Rob Dillingham. And like, there's certainly question marks. And now DiVincenzo is there. So you have Naz, who's literally the reigning 6th man of the year winner. DiVincenzo, who, if he comes off the bench, which I think he will for the season for the Wolves, you're going to have 2 of the best bench guys in the entire league, plus Nickeil Alexander-Walker, plus whatever Rob Dillingham becomes. So there is certainly depth positives for Minnesota. And on the flip side, especially with the Robinson injury, depth concerns for the Knicks, I would say, especially in the backcourt on the Knicks side with losing DiVincenzo, as you mentioned. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a world in which this is a positive trade for both teams this year, and also a world where it's a negative trade for both teams. It's really kind of weird. Where we started was like the timing of this trade between, it's very rare that we see a trade between 2 legit finals contenders and who are both probably trading their second best players, on the eve of training camp. It's such a weird version of a challenge trade, and who knows where we're going to be sitting in 6 months and looking at this thing, but certainly going to be interesting.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think this is one of those where we're just not going to know how to grade this trade until we see it on the floor, because there's a world where I could see this being kind of similar to like the OG trade that the Knicks executed earlier this year, sort of a win-win deal for both sides, where both sides get what they were looking for out of this deal. The Wolves get their financial relief without losing any standing in the West. The Knicks get their sweet shooting big man, who, if this all works out perfectly, could be like the absolute like 100th percentile perfect pairing for Jalen Brunson, which is what they should be looking for right now as a team that I think should be trying to capitalize on what window they get with Brunson and try to actually win a championship with this guy. And yeah, it'll be a fun season, and all that to go through this. But at any rate, we're running a little long at this point. But man, there's so much to talk about. I feel like we could go another hour if we had to, but for now, I think we ought to wrap up. Ben, thanks for popping on with me. Thanks for doing this crossover, and I think this was a ton of fun. And I'll certainly be rooting for Randle and DiVincenzo from afar, especially because they're extremely non-threatening in the other conference and all that.
Yeah, makes it easier. It really does.
Yeah, it's going to be very easy to root for those guys. I hope the T-Wolves do well this year. I've always been low-key. Like, they've been one of my Western Conference teams, Wolf last name, Wolves team name. It's an easy fit. So I'll be rooting for you guys, and excited to see what this season brings.
Yeah, and likewise. Look, this is maybe like a backhanded compliment, I guess. Maybe not even a compliment at all. But when it comes to the Knicks, like, I don't know that there's many Wolves fans that are like, there's a inferiority complex with like the Yankees, as there is with a lot of, the Yankees are often good. I mean, it sounds like you're a Mets fan, but like the Knicks haven't been good in a long time usually, and so it's less of like the big bad Lakers in the West anyway, and so it'll be easier, I think, for Wolves fans to be cheering for Karl-Anthony Towns, and they will be, because Wolves fans love Cat. He's a goofy guy. There's certainly issues that people have picked up on that are fun to poke fun at, some of the issues he has in terms of foul trouble and stuff like that, but he's one of the best offensive players of this generation, and he's just a ton of fun to watch, and he's definitely going to have a positive impact on the Knicks.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing how it works out. and how Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo do in Minnesota. But all we can do now is just kind of wait for media day to happen and start seeing training camp and the preseason unfold. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see these guys at media day probably because the trade isn't technically complete yet.
Yep.
But we'll hear from them soon enough in their new uniforms and see them playing. And we'll have you covered at Locked On Knicks for any Karl-Anthony Towns. Ben will have you covered on Locked On Wolves for any Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo and everything in between. But thank you all for listening, and we'll both talk to you soon. Peace out, everybody.